subscribers. So for this video here today, I don't think it's going to be a very long video. I don't really have much to read for verses, just Revelation 2 and 3 and a couple, like literally two other verses from Luke. So this won't be a very long video, just a heads up. But I will go through something that's very, very interesting. I don't think Christians have really considered. I'm sure that some people have, but it's not a major topic in Christianity, so you wouldn't commonly find it. You know what I mean? You'd have to go looking for it. But I think every Christian should reflect on what Jesus said in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, because it's very easy to think that he's giving an edict to each of the 7 ancient Christian churches, because he's using the ancient names. However, what the average Christian doesn't know is that all of these 7 churches, they weren't around the world. They were all like, in that little tiny region around the Mediterranean. And what Jesus is actually saying, as you'll see from the verses when I read them, he's actually talking about the end days. Okay, the time right up until the end. He's not talking about the ancient churches. If he did, that would be irrelevant, because most of those churches had just started. John got the revelation like a couple decades after Jesus died. It's commonly accepted to be around 70 or 90 AD. Jesus died around, 26 to 30 AD, depending what you believe, a few decades later. No, Jesus gave an edict to all the end days churches, and that would make a lot more sense, because the book of Revelation is for the end days, and even though it's relevant to everybody even 2,000 years before the end days, when the end days arrive and the closer you get to them, it's even more relevant, because that's what it's about. So the 7 churches, these edicts that have gone to the 7 churches in those 2 chapters are actually talking about the end days, like you will see when I read them. And what we have to do as Christians is ask ourselves, okay, well, which of the 7 churches am I in? This isn't the most important thing. I mean, the most important thing is to get right with God and be worthy in time, right? But besides that, it is important because Jesus said this, right? So which of the 7 churches do we fall in? I don't really think, well, I know for a fact Christianity as a whole, collectively, has not sat down over 2,000 years to deduce which of the 7 is which Christian denomination. But at the end of the day, logic tells you that if Jesus says there are 7 assemblies, okay, and he does use the term assembly, he doesn't say church, right? But he says 7 assemblies. This is obviously, using logic, referring to 7 denominations. And not just 7 random denominations, but if you were to break up all of Christianity into, 7 core denominations that each had something unique and that differentiated it in a major way from another, okay? Because a lot of denominations are very similar and they cross over. But if you were to break it up, the whole, into 7 core denominations, I think this is logically what Jesus wanted us to do, right? I don't think this is reaching. I think this is perfectly reasonable. So anybody, because most people are narcissistic in a certain degree, right? Personal pride or whatever. Most people would say, oh, well, I must be in the denomination that got it right. Because out of the 7, Jesus basically congratulated 1, you could say, but all the other 6 he rebuked to varying degrees of rebuke. Some he vomited out of his mouth, and others, he was just like, you have a few things to get right. So everybody personally would just say like, oh yeah, I must be with the denomination that's correct. That's what everybody pompously would say within themselves or want to believe. But at the end of the day, there are 7 denominations and you fall within one of them. He gave descriptions of each of the 7. So I think the only fair way to do this is to ignore the Church of Philadelphia for now. I'll still read it, but Philadelphia is the one that got it right. Now I think these names like Smyrna, Philadelphia, Ephesus, even though they are the ancient church names, I think God is obviously using them cryptically as a symbol, right? Those were the churches that people knew at the time. This has struck me. It's actually quite wise. Those were the churches and the names and probably denominations that people were familiar with in John's time, right? If Jesus was to come to John and start talking about Baptists and Lutherans, nobody would know what the heck he's talking about for like 1,500 years or whatever. So it does make sense that God would use those terms they are familiar with to represent, in the end days, 7 latter denominations. So the one that got it right was Philadelphia. But let's not just proudly assume that we are of, each of us, that we are of Philadelphia. Let's go look at the description of all the other ones and Philadelphia and see what makes them different. That's the only way you could really tell which denominations are probably which of the 7 assemblies. So the important thing to remember, like I said, is he rebuked 6 of the 7. Okay, some of them he vomited out of his mouth, right? Utterly rebuked to that type of degree. Others he accepted readily, like Philadelphia. So there's a whole scale of worthiness here, and getting it rightness, because a lot of the denominations he has said has gotten it wrong. So if you go to Revelation 2, right? What I do have here is a little breakdown of all the core denominations of Christianity. Okay, the overall population of Christianity is around 2.5 billion, but I've gotten it all broken down here. I studied, this is from a little while ago. I can't remember a few things like about Anglican, Baptist, and Methodist or whatever, but I remember most of the others, sufficient for this video. But what we can see is looking at all the core denominations, and then what I did is I kind of grouped them in similar or different beliefs, like key things. This is what I did. So this is probably fairly accurate, or fairly close to what the breakdown of the 7 might be. Okay, so should I say the breakdown? Well, I'll mention this now because it's quick, easy to get out of the way. The Catholic denomination is roughly 1.3 billion people. Okay, the Orthodoxy, which I'm assuming, because remember these notes are like months old now, Orthodoxy might include the few different branches of Orthodoxy, like Eastern Orthodoxy and maybe Greek Orthodoxy, but the Orthodoxy is only 220 million. So Catholic is very large, and they're definitely a singular denomination. Orthodoxy I've grouped as a separate denomination. They have slight differences, but let's just keep things simple for now. That's 220 million. So we're only up to 1.5 billion. There's another approximately 1 billion Christians left. So how do they break down? Well, there's actually around 900 million Protestants. That's quite shocking. So Protestant Christianity is a huge denomination. Then you have approximately 100 or 150 or so non-denominational, or fit into other categories like non-Trinitarian and so forth. So that's the major breakdown. So you have Catholic with 1.3 billion, Orthodoxy with 220 million, then you have Protestant with 900 million, then you have non-Trinitarian. There are about 100 million non-Trinitarians, and then approximately like 30 to 50 million, just non-denominational ones that, you can't fit into a major category. And they're not populous or unique enough, well, they're not populous enough to warrant having their own denomination. So, in Revelation 2, Jesus says, "To the messenger of the Ephesian assembly write, These things saith he who is holding the 7 stars in his right hand, who is walking in the midst of the 7 lampstands, the golden. I have known thy works and thy labor and thy endurance, and that thou art not able to bear evil ones, and that thou hast tried those saying themselves to be apostles, and are not, and hast found them liars. And thou didst bear and hast endurance, and because my name has toiled, and has not been weary. But I have against thee one thing." So this denomination he's kind of given praise to, He hasn't shot them down really, but here he's pointing out something that he's rebuking, right? So he says, "But I have against thee that thy first love thou did leave." So what I think this applies to, because I thought about that for a very long time, in comparison to the other denominations that Jesus describes, this one he has said as being unique because they have lost their first love. So I think that this is probably, as I mentioned here, where is it? Right here. Supersessionism or replacement theology. So that is a large denomination in Christianity, which is probably around 200 million, maybe 300 million people that believe such, depending on what church they go to. And they believe that, Judaism was, bad and wrong and done away with. It's dead and gone. It was, cursed and replaced. That's supersessionism and replacement theology. So of all the other, I mean, that definitely does go against what Jesus taught. So that belief is wrong. So that Jesus says, I have against thee that thy first love thou did leave. Remember then whence thou has fallen, and reform, and the first works do, and if not, I come to thee quickly, and will remove thy lampstand from its place, if thou mayest not reform. But this thou hast, that thou dost hate the works of the Nicolaitans, that I also hate. He who is having an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the assemblies. To him who is overcoming, I will give to him to eat of the tree of life that is in the midst of the paradise of God. So, they don't have like a terrible outright rebuking. So, of the 7 assemblies, some of them are talked about very badly, right? This one here is not, it's not really put down that much. It's just saying that you forgot your first love. So I think that this is supersessionism, replacement theology. There's around 200 or 300 million Christians as such, right? So outside of that error, they might be pretty close, to getting it right, you could say. But let's go on to the next one, which is, where is it? In verse 8, and to the messenger of the assembly of the Smyrnians write, these things saith the first and the last, who did become dead and did live. I have known thy works in tribulation and poverty, yet thou art rich, and the evil speaking of those saying themselves to be Jews, and are not, but are a synagogue of the adversary. So this is very interesting, because this is actually a small denomination, but I think because they are maybe what they believe and teach and whatever, I'm not sure, that they weren't being mentioned by Jesus. So this is a group that probably is under 50 million, depending on who's included in this group. But this would be the smaller churches and, groups within Christianity that believe that they have to keep the Jewish law, the Jewish law and all that there. Essentially, that they think that they are Jews, Jewish keeping Judaism and all of that there, but they're Judaism Christians. There's different groups. I don't want to call some of them out by name here and seem like I'm picking enemies. But this description here that Jesus gave, that's what makes it unique from the others of the 7, right? They're claiming to be Jews, but they are not. They're a synagogue of the adversary. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're evil or satanic. It just means that, they're the ones claiming to follow Judaism. Okay? Now, he rebukes this denomination stronger than Ephesius, I think. But he says, be not afraid of the things that thou art about to suffer. The devil is about to cast you to prison, that ye may be tried, and ye have tribulation 10 days. I'm not quite sure what that would pertain to, but nonetheless, become thou faithful unto death, and I will give to thee the crown of the life. So it's not like an outright rebuking. It does say synagogue of the adversary, but that might just be in terms of them being deceived or doing certain sins, right? It might not mean that they're outright evil. But nonetheless, that's Smyrna. So that obviously pertains to probably Christian denominations, or the overall denomination that teaches Judaism, right? Seventh-day Adventists teach that you have to keep the Sabbath and stuff like that there. They might possibly be included under Smyrna, but I think that church falls under one of the later. But anyway, so let's move on. And to the messenger of the assembly in Pergamos. So for Pergamos, I believe that this is the Catholics. Messianic Christians. Like I said, I didn't really want to call certain groups out. But Messianic Christians might be under Smyrna. You know what I mean? Even if you are biologically, Jewish, like your family is Jewish, and, you're an actual Jewish Christian, Messianic Christian, whatever, right? At the end of the day, if what you're doing is following the Jewish law and not the Christian law, I don't know. That's a complex issue, but that's who that pertains to, Smyrna. For Pergamos, I think this would probably pertain to the Catholics. So it says, where is it? And to the messenger of the assembly in Pergamos, write, these things saith he who is having the sharp two-edged sword. I have known thy works, where thou dost dwell, where the throne of the adversary is, and thou dost hold fast my name, and thou did not deny my faith. Even in the days of Antipas was my faithful witness, who was put to death beside you, where the adversary does dwell. But I have against thee a few things. So, overall Catholicism is pretty good. I personally think that theologically they do some things that are wrong, to different degrees. Some are very wrong, some are less wrong, right? But overall, Catholicism did help spread Christianity throughout Greece and Rome and Europe and the known world at the time. And there was about 90 to 100 million Christians within 100 years, I think, because of all the various efforts. And even if many Christians believe, oh, Catholics have it wrong, at the end of the day, you can't take that away from them. They helped establish Christianity in the earth, right, and help spread it, even though some of them did bad to help it, you know what I mean? At the end of the day, it was spreading Christianity. So you have to reflect on that. And there's a lot of good people in Catholicism, very faithful people, you know what I mean? So that's why, only one or two of the denominations are kind of like shot down by Jesus a lot harsher. A lot of them, he's giving them, it's not like a leeway, but, he's praising them where it's deserved. He's rebuking them where it's deserved, right? So he gave them a few praises here. But he says, I have against thee a few things, that thou hast there those holding the teaching of Balaam. So basically a false prophet who did teach Balak to cast a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat idol sacrifices and to commit whoredom. So, long story short, I'm not going to spend an hour justifying why I think each one is this. But I do believe out of all the major denominations that this applies strongest to Catholics. There is another one that teaches idolatry, but I believe that this is another group which is actually worse off. So I'm actually putting Catholics in a better position than this other group, which also has a false prophet, right? But this one here is where they fall is where they eat idol sacrifices and commit whoredom. So one of the idol sacrifices, in my opinion, would be where they try to literally believe that they're eating the flesh and blood of Jesus during their sacrifice, you could say. The obvious idolatry of statues and so forth, and honoring saints and praying to Mary and all of that there, right? So that would make sense, idol sacrifices and committing whoredom. So the next one would be, and whoredom would refer to whoring yourself out to others, so that would make sense where they forced Catholicism upon the others, even other Christians. They used to put a lot of non-Trinitarians to death. If you were a non-Trinitarian, they would put you to death and probably even torture you back in the day. Unfortunately, right? So commit whoredom, that makes sense as well. Says thou, even thou, those holding the teaching of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. And I think what it's saying is that he's rebuking them for having something similar to the teachings of the Nicolaitans. The teachings of the Nicolaitans were lost to the ages, but a few ancient writers kind of referenced them and alluded to the fact that they took the certain verses that were metaphorical too literally, such as you must eat the flesh of the Son of Man. So they thought that was like a secret code for cannibalism, gives you immortal life, or was part of the ritual, or even babies, and they would have rampant sexual orgies and stuff like that. This is what is alleged. We don't know if that's true or not, because often people would say bad things of other groups back then. But if that was true, then I think it's just an illusion. He's not saying you're doing the deeds of the Nicolaitans. But what I think it is it's an allusion to what they're doing is similar to the Nicolaitans. And if it's true the Nicolaitans, took the Eucharist as eating actual flesh and blood of people, if that is true, then by Catholicism saying and swearing as a creed that they believe they are drinking the blood of Jesus and the flesh and eating the flesh of Jesus, then that would put them in in that illusion. So it does kind of make sense. So he says, reform, and if not, I come to thee quickly, and I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Now this is one of the verses that shows you that Jesus is actually giving an edict to the end days churches, not to the ancient churches. Because he's talking about, if you don't get it right, when I come, I will fight against you. Okay, so that's pretty strong talk right there. So he must really hate certain things that this group does. Okay, but he did give them praises, for their faith or whatever it was. So I think this is probably the Catholic denomination. But he says, he who is having an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the assemblies. To him who is overcoming, I will give to him to eat from the hidden manna, and I will give to him a white stone, and upon the stone a new name written, and that no one knew except him who is receiving it. And to the messenger of the assembly of Thyatira. So this is the next group. This one here is slightly harder to pinpoint, but because it's defined by false prophets, I have a rough idea of who it might include. So it says, "Unto the messenger of the assembly of Thyatira write, These things saith the Son of God, who is having his eyes as a flame of fire, and his feet like fine brass. And I have known thy works, and thy love and ministration, and thy faith, and thy endurance, and thy works. And the last are more than the first." So they get some praises. "But I have against thee a few things," right? Whereas before, that one denomination, he had one major thing against. This one here, they have a few major things. He says that thou dost suffer the woman Jezebel, and I think this is symbolic, who is calling herself a prophetess, to teach and lead astray my servants to commit whoredom and idol sacrifices to eat. And I did give to her a time that she might reform from her whoredom, and she did not reform. Lo, I will cast her into a couch, and those committing adultery with her into great tribulation, if they may not repent of their works. And her children I will kill in death, and know shall all the assemblies that I am he who is searching reins and hearts, and I'll give to you to each according to your works. So that's some pretty strong rebuking. So this group here must be a lot worse than Pergamos. Pergamos got praise and it got some rebuke, but I think this rebuke is a lot worse. So I don't think it has to literally be just the female false prophet. I think it's generally any false prophet. It's just picking ancient characters like Balaam and Jezebel to compare to, right? Jezebel, because Jezebel whored herself out. She was a harlot. Balaam didn't whore himself out, but he gave false prophecy. But nonetheless, Thyatira, right? I think Thyatira includes the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They did have a false prophet female teacher. I think it also includes denominations that had male false prophets, such as Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormon Church and all the other small churches. But these actually have small numbers. Adventists only have about 20 million people. Jehovah's Witnesses are under 10 million, and Mormons are only about 17 million. So this combined and with other smaller groups that have false prophets and such, you're not looking at very many. You're looking at around 50 million. But I think it's possible that Pentecostal could be included in here. I'm not really fussing over which group is which. But Pentecostal could be, because they're out there always speaking in these fake tongues, which the New Testament rebukes anyways. And there's a lot of false prophets in Pentecostal. A lot of false prophets. So Pentecostal has about 280 million people. So when you combine them all, that's about 330 million. So that makes it a major group. So Thyatira is rebuked. The overall sin of Thyatira is false prophecy and idolatry, right? But God gave her time to reform, but there will come utter rebuke if they don't reform. "And to you I say, and to the rest who are in Thyatira, as many as have not this teaching, and who did not know the depths of the adversary, as they say, I will not put upon you another burden, but that which ye have hold ye till I may come. And he who is overcoming, and he who is keeping unto the end my works, I will give to him authority over the nations. And ye shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of the potter they shall be broken, as I also have received from my Father. And I will give to him the morning star. He who is having an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the assemblies." So God gives terrible rebuke in places, but at the same time he gives praise and he gives a way out. You know what I mean? There's always a way out. It's reformation. He teaches and commands reformation to almost all of the seven denominations here. So that's Revelation 2. So we just have Revelation 3 left. So the final three, we have Sardis, which is fairly good, but they don't have it completely correct. Then we get Philadelphia, which is the only one of the seven who gets congratulated as if they did get it correct. And then we have Laodicea, which is so bad that they get vomited out. So these are the final three. "And to the messenger of the assembly in Sardis write, These things saith he who is having the seven spirits of God and the seven stars. I have known thy works, and that thou hast the name that thou didst live, and thou art dead. Become watching and strengthen the rest of the things that are about to die, for I have not found thy works fulfilled before God." So here we have a little rebuke. They're actually dead, right? So in a sense, they're spiritually dead or whatever, right? They're in a symbolic sense, they are dead. So they're not really succeeding. They're not really getting it right. And he hasn't found the works fulfilled. Okay? I think that Sardis is made up of Protestant denominations. The less Calvinist ones. The ones that are more strictly Calvinist, I believe, probably belong to Laodicea. But nonetheless, I believe that Anglican, Methodist, and some Baptist These groups here, that's 110 million, 70 million, and 100 million. Again, we're looking at around 350 million-ish Christians falling under the Protestant group. Some members of my family were part of this group, and even though I think that their churches taught certain things that were theologically wrong, overall, their churches and denoms taught to be very good people and this and that there. So they might have some things theologically wrong that are actually very wrong, but overall, they're actually good people and stuff, right? But he says, I have not found thy works fulfilled before God. He says, remember then how it's received and heard, and be keeping and reform. So that's like a reminder to, go back to the scriptures, read what you're actually supposed to do, right? Be keeping and reform. If then thou mayest not watch. So that's a hint that these churches don't teach to reform. Most Christian denoms today don't teach to reform. But Protestantism basically came from the Calvinist ideology. I was shocked to learn that. I was dismayed. But nonetheless, right? Because I grew up in Protestant churches and such. But they actually stem from the Calvinist belief, which is once saved, always saved, which is a great heresy. So, I have not found thy works fulfilled before God. That's a reference to that there. So, but they're not as Calvinist as other groups. They're less severe, right? Teach their own. Each church teaches a little different. That's where it gets complicated. But there's actually quite a lot of these churches, about 330. Sorry, a lot of people in these churches, about 330 million. So he says, reform, if thou mayest not watch, it will come upon thee as a thief, and thou mayest not know what hour I will come upon thee. So again, this is a reference to him coming in the end days, so some of the end days churches. He says, thou hast a few names even in Sardis who did not defile their garments. So these, even though they're in these churches who are teaching something wrong, they're actually getting it right. There's a lot of good people in this denomination, right? They did not defile their garments, these few, and they shall walk with me in white because they are worthy. So this is a praise not found given to the other denoms, right? So this denom here is quite close to getting it right, you could say. And he says, he who is overcoming, this one shall be arrayed in white garments, shall not blot out his name from the scroll of the life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his messengers. He who is having an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the assemblies. And to the so that's Sardis. And the next one is Philadelphia, right? Well, let me read Laodicea first, and end on a positive note with Philadelphia. So in verse 14, to the messenger of the assembly of the Laodiceans write, these things saith the Amen, the witness, faithful and true, the chief of the creation of God. Now this denomination gets the worst rebuke of any of them. So when you look at all the Christian denominations today, like I said, leaving out Philadelphia, we could all want to be a part of Philadelphia, want our denomination to be Philadelphia, but leave that one out. Be fair. Look at all the major denominations out there, how they differ in what they believe. I'll do a quick synopsis and sum up at the end, right, to make it easier for everybody. Laodicea has to be the worst. And it's not that I'm trying to demonize people or I think people are evil and this and that there, right? It's just out of our available options, what are we stuck with, right? I don't think Catholicism belongs in this group. I don't think Messianic Judaism belongs in this group. I don't think that necessarily even Pentecostal and others and Protestant belong in this group. It is one that must be so bad. In what way could it be so offensively wrong to God? And I think that's a group that teaches against Reformation. That's why I have Luke 13 here. Jesus says in verse 2, and Jesus answering said to them, Think ye that these Galileans became sinners beyond all the Galileans because they have suffered such things? No. I say to you, but if ye may not reform, all you even so shall perish. And in verse 5 he repeats it, No, I say to you, but if ye may not reform, all ye in like manner shall perish. And there's about 50 verses. I have lots of videos on this where I go through all the reform verses in the New Testament. There are so many. It's commanded verbatim to us to reform. He does command all men everywhere to reform. We heard that there, Jesus saying, if you don't reform, you will perish. That is so much, and there's even a verse where it verbatim says that it is the gospel to go out and to teach all men and all nations everywhere to reform. So, if you're not, which denomination rebukes that concept? Calvinism. At its highest point, the one that represents that false belief system the most is Calvinism. It rebukes Reformation. Calvinism says once saved, always saved. works don't matter and all that. And even though you might be a good person, these people get led astray so quickly, and they end up doing bad and feeling like they won't get punished for it. This is actually one of the worst sins you could do. Idolatry is bad too, but God punishes idolatry in its own way, like he said to the other churches. This church, this denomination is not guilty necessarily of idolatry, I'm pretty sure, unless it does say that. It does something else that makes it so bad. He says, I have known thy works, that neither cold art thou nor hot. I wish thou wert cold or hot. So they gotten it totally wrong on works. So because thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I'm about to vomit thee out of my mouth. So these are people who probably think that they're doing good. They're Christian. They claim to be Christian. They teach goodness type of thing. But they teach that once saved, always saved. Works don't matter. Doesn't matter if you do bad, it will be swept under the rug, that type of thing. That type of abomination, that heresy, right? Being lukewarm. He says, I'm about to vomit thee out of my mouth. So as harsh as that is, of all the denominations we have that are not guilty of idolatry and such and false prophecy, which group is left here? I think this is the most applicable. So we have probably, and I think a lot of Pentecostal groups fall into this as well. So we have between 1 and probably 200 million, depending on how many would fall into that group. And it's unfortunate, but and also the prosperity preachers. I think they're definitely defined here in this, in verse 17, because thou sayest, I am rich, I have grown rich, and have need of nothing, and thou hast not known that thou art the wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. So not only does this directly apply to prophecy, church theology, prosperity church theology, but it also applies to Calvinism, because they believe that they're rich, that they have the ultimate prize, salvation, just by picking out Jesus. And they have the ultimate prize package. They're guaranteed the greatest gift of immortality and all of that and salvation, right? So they think they're so rich, right? And that they have no need of anything, right? So I think that applies. And he says, I counsel thee to buy from me gold fired by fire. That's refining. That's reformation. When you stop sinning, you're being punished, and also you're stopping your sinning. You're being recompensed to. You're being burned in the fire to be refined and to come out white, right? So he says, I counsel thee to buy from me gold fired by fire. You see, Calvinists and such don't believe they need reformation. They don't believe that they need to be refined. They think they're good to go and guaranteed white. But God says, counsel thee to buy from me gold fired by fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white garments, that thou mayest be arrayed, and the shame of thy nakedness may not be manifest, and with eye salve anoint thine eyes, that thou mayest see. Because they're so blind to the theological error that they're making, right? As many as I love, I do convict and chasten, be zealous then and reform. So he does reassure them and say, I love you. That's why I want you to reform. So he's teaching them again, reform. He says, I have stood at the door, lo, and I knock. If anyone may hear my voice and may open the door, I will come unto him, and will sup with him, and he with me. He who is overcoming, I will give to him to sit with me in my throne, as I also did overcome and did sit down with my Father in his throne. He who is having an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the assemblies. So that's all 7 assemblies given their edicts, okay? Now, I just want to mention this before I give the quick synopsis, because so many Christian denominations teach a Calvinist-type ideology, right? Protestantism, that's 900 million right there. Almost all of them do, to a degree, right? If we search the New Testament for the term lawless, we'll see some very important things. We get 17 results. The first one, Matthew 7:23. If it's so true, once saved, always saved, what you have done, well, your past sins are forgiven, even according to non-Trinitarian theology, right? The true theology, in my opinion. But nonetheless, right? I'm not saying your sins are never forgiven. Of course they are. Your past ones are, but not your current or your future. You have to be good, right? But Jesus says, and then I will acknowledge to them that I never knew you. Depart from me, ye who are working lawlessness. So he's talking about in the end days, when he arrives, Christians will come to him saying, let us in. He'll say, no, get away from me, you who are working lawlessness. That means he's rebuking the Christians, even though they're Christians, right, and claiming his name, they're working lawlessness, which means they don't believe they're under a law. Once saved, always saved. We're not under a law. We've guaranteed salvation. Those type churches, okay? And inclusive of anybody else who's doing lawlessness, right? Matthew 23:28. So also ye outwardly indeed do appear to men righteous, and within ye are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And if we actually scroll down to 2 Thessalonians, the mention of lawlessness, remember there's only 17 mentions of this word, right? In here, we're hearing about the so-called Antichrist, even though it doesn't say it's the Antichrist. It's what every Christian commonly thinks is talking about the Antichrist. So if we open that up, 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 7, right? About him who sits on the throne of God and raised himself up above all others, all that there, right? And we go to in verse 6, and now what is keeping down ye have known, for his being revealed in his own time. This big spooky guy. Who's this big spooky guy? Well, I think it was the actual Antichrist, who was the founding prophet of Islam, which was the final beast kingdom. But let's not go there. I think that also spiritually applies to anybody who's teaching lawlessness, because at the end of the day, that's what Satan would teach. That's what any Antichrist would teach. Anyone who has fallen away does lawlessness. I have videos on this as well. If you look up all the terms fall away in the New Testament, you see it applies to committing lawlessness, right? So he says, his being revealed in his own time. So even though I believe that's referring to the false prophet of Islam who founded that religion and all that, even though that's what I believe, it still applies to anybody else who falls in that type of category, right? It says, for the secret of the lawlessness does already work. Only he who is keeping down now will hinder that till he may be out of the way, and then shall be revealed the lawless one. So who's this lawless one? Whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy at the manifestation of his presence. Now, why am I mentioning that? Because everybody commonly thinks this is talking about the Antichrist. Well, whatever you believe about it, who really cares for now? The point is, it defines him as being lawless. But there's a lot of Christian denominations that literally teach we're not under law. That's the difference. So, that's just letting you know that these churches that teach that, they're wrong, right? The big bad guy is defined as the lawless one. Jesus turns away those who are being lawless, but yet we have a lot of hundreds of millions of Christians that believe that they're not under law. And they do deeds of lawlessness, but believe they won't be punished for it. That's the height of ridiculousness, right? In Titus 2:14, who did give himself for us that he might ransom us from all lawlessness? I mean, there you go. Hebrews 1:9, thou did love righteousness and did hate lawlessness. In 1 John 3:4, it fully defines it. Everyone who is doing the sin, the lawlessness, also he does do, and the sin is the lawlessness. So if you believe once saved, always saved, and those type of things, and that no matter what you did or do, more importantly, what you do or what you will do, you believe those things don't matter, you won't be punished for it, you're just guaranteed salvation, you're living in lawlessness. That's just an example. But it also directly applies to those who are living lawless. You know what I mean? Calling themselves Christian or not. So overall, we have 7 core denominations that Jesus has described. We have Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. We have Philadelphia who got it right. So let's not just magnetize ourselves to that and assume we know who it is, because it doesn't really give a theological hint as to what they believe, right? If we look at Laodicea, it's something so bad, the one I just went through, that God vomits it out. But it's not guilty of idolatry and false prophecy. So what could it believe? So I just went through that one. I believe it's the prosperity churches, most so. A lot of different Pentecostal type churches who are just out there, talking about how you're guaranteed this and guaranteed that. And Calvinist churches in a similar fashion, like I just mentioned. So I think, unfortunately, it's not that I want anybody to be in the worst category, but somebody's going to be. I think those are the ones that are in Laodicea, right? Sardis, like I already mentioned, I think these are the Protestant groups that are more attuned to the truth. I mean, a lot of Protestants teach a Calvinist type of ideology, but a lot of these, hundreds of millions of these Christians in these certain churches teach their own under this umbrella of Protestantism. They're very good people because they're taught to be good, and they do good deeds. They do charity. They're very wonderful, loving people, you know what I mean? And they help spread, the knowledge and the Word of God. So these ones are very, very close, but they get something wrong, which is that they have to reform. So I believe that this is those Protestant groups. And then we have Thyatira, who is identified as one being spreading false prophecy with false prophets and idolatry, and they have to reform. So again, I think Thyatira has to be all the churches defined by false prophets, which would be Adventistry, Jehovah's Witness, the Mormons, a lot of Pentecostals. All those guys out there on YouTube are always out there, within these groups and somewhat out there. I don't know if every one of these guys is a Pentecostal on YouTube, but I'm just saying, ones who are out there in these type of subgroups giving all these fake prophecies every day, you'll see them and none of them come true, but they're always out there saying this will be a year of blessing and prosperity. You know what I mean? God will speak to us. They're just giving out this hollow, waffling nonsense. And they do it all the time. There's a lot of churches that do that, right? So I think that one there is Thyatira. And Pergamos, I believe, is the Catholics. Like I said, they're guilty of following a false prophet, but he's not to the degree of the Jezebel of Thyatira, the Jezebels of Thyatira. And I already went through a fair detail of Pergamos, so I think it's the Catholic Church. And there was a lot of praise given to it as well for all the hard work that it's did in the faith. So I think that's the Catholic Church. And then we have Smyrna, which is very unique because it's those pretending to be Jews but who are not Jews. So those who are keeping Judaism but shouldn't be keeping Judaism. So that again is probably only about 50 million or less Christians, but that is such a unique category of incorrectedness in theology that Jesus defined it as one of the seven assemblies. And I think it's not just defined by one, it's probably a lot of the churches collectively who believe you have to keep the Jewish law and all of that there. And ironically, Seventh-day Adventists could fall into this as well. But then we have Ephesius, the last one, which I believe is supersessionism and replacement theology, which I believe, if I'm not incorrect, is the Orthodox churches. So I think the Orthodoxy is Ephesus. Generally, they're pretty good, but the problem is they've fallen away from their first love. So it's like they've forgotten the Old Testament, you know what I mean? They don't really see the connection between Jesus and the Old Testament. They've taught that certain things shouldn't be honored and so forth. So, but anyways, I think that's the breakdown. I think it's a very logical breakdown of all the core denominations that are out there because, again, like I said, there's about 2.5 billion Christians. We have about 1.3 billion Catholics. I think that's Pergamos. We have about 200 plus million Orthodoxy, which I say is probably Ephesus. Then we have 900 million Protestants. Okay, I believe it's the non-Trinitarians who are in Philadelphia, but nonetheless, that's just my belief. But out of the 900 million other Protestants, because non-Trinitarians aren't under Protestant denomination, 900 million Protestants, that's a lot of people. So in that breakdown, we have Anglican has about 110 million. So let's just say 100 million. Lutheran is at 80 million. Methodist 70 million. Baptist 100 million. Seventh-day Adventist 20 million. Jehovah's Witness 9 million. Mormon 17 million. Pentecostal 280 million. Calvinist 80 million. So that's quite a lot. It adds up to around 900 million Christians. So they're all going to fall into one of these seven, right? Jesus gave the unique characteristics of the seven. This is something very important that we all need to think about because he taught almost every one of those seven denominations to reform. He commanded it. In some instances, reform. If not, I will fight against you with the sword of my mouth, right? Another one, reform, or I will come upon thee like a thief and catch you by surprise, right? So what Christians need to do is reform. But there is one denomination that he didn't have to say all that to. That was Philadelphia, okay? Because the Church of Philadelphia is the only one that doesn't need. I'm just going to Uber verify that, I'm pretty sure. But I like making sure of things. So if I search Philadelphia, the only one he didn't have to teach that to was Philadelphia. So that's starting at 3:7. Let's see. Just reading it real quick. Yep, there's no mention of it. So that's one of the. There might have been another one he didn't have to mention it, but that's because he was spitting them out of his mouth or whatever else it might be. But the church that is defined by not needing to reform because it's teaching to reform, that only really applies to non-Trinitarians. And even within the non-Trinitarian umbrella, very few actually teach that theology. So unfortunately, it's a small group, but it has to be one of the seven because it's the correct theology. That's the one that gets it right. It actually teaches Reformation. And trust me, none of those denominations that I showed there actually teach Reformation. Not one of them. Okay? Catholicism teaches a form of it, you could say, but the form and the way that they do it is wrong. Where, I can't remember the name of it right now. I just can't remember the penance. I think that's what it is, right? Stuff like that there. There's different ways of penance, but the more, wrong ones, abusive ones, they're wrong. But stuff like that shouldn't be done. That's not what Reformation is. Reformation is about a change. And none of them, Catholicism does not teach to reform. Orthodoxy doesn't teach to reform. Protestant certainly does not teach to reform. None of them, Messianic, none of them teach to reform. The only ones that teach to reform are the non-Trinitarian, and only some of the non-Trinitarian groups. But those are the ones that have it right. You have to reform. And if you have, then you'll be ready for when Jesus comes. You won't be caught by surprise. He won't fight against you with a sword. He'll come and take you and take you away. So, anyways, folks, God bless you all. That's it for this video. I don't want to keep it any longer. But it's important because Christians aren't even thinking about this. Everybody just assumes they have it right. Their church has it right. But I'm telling you now, there's 2.5 billion Christians, all these major denominations. They're not all right because they'll teach very different things. Okay, Jesus says one of them has it right, and others are good to bad on a varying scale. All right, but they all need to reform except for that one. That's the essence of it, right? So when Jesus comes back, do you want to risk being in one of those groups and you don't reform? So if you don't reform, he says, I'll come and fight against you with the sword in my mouth. That's quite different than saying, I'll come and rescue you. Right? So if you're not reforming, you're in one of these bad denominations who have it wrong, and you're not reforming, he's actually going to fight against you. And stuff like that. So that's some serious talk. That's some serious rebuke. That's why Christians need to take it seriously, and they're not. They're oblivious to the fact that he's giving these edicts to the end days churches. Everybody just assumes they're in the right boat, but at the end of the day, it could very well be that a majority of Christians are going to be strongly rebuked, or maybe even turned away in the end days. Right? If you're doing lawlessness, Jesus will turn you away. He said that. Those committing lawlessness won't get into heaven. He says that elsewhere in Revelations, to be kept out, where all the fire is. So, if you're doing lawlessness, no matter what your church teaches, if you're doing lawlessness, you're in the bad category. That's the thing. You have to be good, you have to have reformed. If you're doing badness, you haven't reformed. You could reform, and you could go off and do badness, but you broke your reformation. So, I don't think anybody can be perfect, per se, but that's not the point. It is just as hard to be bad as it is to be good. It requires just as much effort to be bad as it does to be good. At the end of the day, on judgment, we'd all just be, chastised for giving excuses to go off and be bad. Even if you did reform and you start doing bad things again, you tarnish your reformation, you start grieving the Holy Spirit away. It's really only our fault. And that's why everybody needs to reform. God's not going to let people into heaven that don't deserve to be there just because they want to be there. That's not good enough. You have to live on earth as you would in heaven. And if you haven't bothered to do that, then why should you be let into heaven? You know what I mean? If you got sent to prison, for example, and you're in prison and you served your 20 years, and at the end of the 20 years you're just as bad as when you went in there, they may not give you release. You know what I mean? And you're definitely not going to earn an earlier probation if you haven't learned a lesson, you haven't changed and made a change. But if you make a change and you show that you're good, you might be eligible for early release. That's the difference, and that's how it relates. So if you're not living on earth as is in heaven, if you're not living in that prison like it should be lived on the outside, being an upstanding citizen, then you're not going to be released. Right? You're not going to be accepted in to the outer civilization, to our new earth and all that. You're not going to be accepted into paradise if you're not living on earth as it is done up there. You know what I mean? You're going to be banging on the gate saying, let me in, and they're going to be saying, why should we let you in? Well, because I want to be, and I think I deserve it. And they're going to say, yeah, but you do all this bad stuff down there, and, you never really bothered to stop it. And when you come up here, what are you going to do it up here? Oh, no, I won't do it. You had your time here to prove that you could go without it, but you know what I mean? Why should they give you a chance to do it up there? No, you have your time here to prove it. So if you don't live on earth as you would in heaven, why should you get a chance to go to heaven? That's the thing. And does your church teach you to live on earth as it is in heaven? That's the thing. Does it? A lot of churches don't. But anyways, God bless you all, folks. Everybody take care. Hopefully, Jesus does return in 2023.